The small town of Millfield, nestled deep in the snow-covered hills of Vermont, looked like it had been plucked straight out of a Christmas card. Each December, its streets glowed with string lights, wreaths adorned every door, and the air was filled with the mingling scents of fresh pine and baked gingerbread. The town was home to the Douglas family, a loving yet ordinary household, with their share of struggles, hopes, and dreams. At the heart of their family was Roddy, their 3-year-old golden retriever, a constant source of joy, loyalty, and boundless energy. The Douglases were no strangers to challenges. This Christmas marked the first one since Laura Douglas, the matriarch, had lost her job at the local bakery. Her husband Tom worked long hours at the paper mill, leaving him exhausted and often distant. Their children, 11-year-old Abby and 6-year-old Nathan, had started to sense the strain in their home. But like many families, they soldiered on, clinging to the magic of Christmas as a chance to rekindle hope. Roddy, however, had no understanding of bills, overdue payments, or adult worries. For him, life was about play, affection, and the silent vow he had made the day he was brought home as a puppy, to protect and bring happiness to his family. He was the glue that held them together, the golden ray of sunshine in their gray days. This particular Christmas, though, Roddy would prove to be much more than just a loyal pet. It was Christmas Eve, and the family had gathered in the living room. The crackling fireplace bathed the room in a soft orange glow, while the Christmas tree sparkled with mismatched ornaments the kids had made over the years. Abby and Nathan were buzzing with excitement, eagerly awaiting Santa's visit, while Tom and Laura exchanged tired but warm smiles, trying to mask the weight of their worries. As the night wore on and the children grew sleepy, Laura ushered them upstairs. "Don't forget to leave the cookies for Santa," Nathan shouted as he bounded up the stairs, dragging a half-asleep Abby behind him. Tom placed a hand on Laura's shoulder. "Go on to bed, honey. I'll lock up." She nodded, kissed him on the cheek, and headed upstairs. Tom sat alone for a moment, staring at the twinkling lights on the tree. He sighed deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. Roddy, sensing his owner's melancholy, padded over and rested his head on Tom's knee. "What would I do without you, buddy?" Tom whispered, scratching behind Roddy's ears. The golden retriever thumped his tail in quiet reply. As the clock struck midnight, the house was silent, save for the faint snores of its sleeping inhabitants. Roddy, who usually curled up at the foot of Tom and Laura's bed, found himself restless. He trotted downstairs to the living room, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. The tree stood tall and majestic, its ornaments reflecting the flickering flames of the dying fire. That's when Roddy noticed it. Beneath the Christmas tree, tucked among the carefully wrapped gifts, was something that hadn't been there before. A white envelope, slightly crumpled at the edges, peeked out from the branches. Roddy tilted his head, his instincts piqued. He sniffed the envelope curiously, the faintest scent of something unfamiliar tickling his nose. There was no sound, no indication of how it had gotten there. It simply appeared. Roddy nudged the envelope gently with his nose, and it slid further into the room, catching the firelight. His tail wagged uncertainly as he nosed it again, this time picking it up carefully in his mouth. It wasn't heavy, but something about it felt important, urgent even. The golden retriever padded upstairs with the envelope, his instincts guiding him to Abby's room. He pawed at her door softly, letting out a low whine. Abby stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Roddy, what is it, boy?" she mumbled sleepily. The dog placed the envelope on the edge of her bed, wagging his tail expectantly. Abby sat up, rubbing her eyes. The envelope caught her attention immediately. "What's this?" she asked, picking it up. Her name was scrawled on the front in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. The paper felt old, the kind you'd find in an attic or a dusty bookstore. Abby hesitated, her heart beating a little faster. Roddy sat patiently, watching her with his warm, trusting eyes. Something about his presence made her feel braver. Abby slid her finger under the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded carefully in thirds. She unfolded it, revealing a handwritten letter. The words were simple but profound, carrying a weight she didn't quite understand yet. As she read, her breath hitched and her small hands trembled slightly. She looked down at Roddy, who gazed up at her with unwavering loyalty. "Roddy," she whispered, her voice tinged with awe and a hint of fear. This is a letter from Mom. But Laura had never written this letter, and the contents would soon shake the foundation of everything the Douglas family thought they knew about themselves. Abby sat frozen on her bed, the crinkled letter trembling in her hands. The familiar yet unplaceable handwriting sprawled across the page called to her, tugging at her curiosity and igniting a flicker of unease. She glanced again at the signature at the bottom. "Love always, Mom." The words didn't make sense. This wasn't her mother's handwriting. Abby's mom never wrote letters like this, and if it wasn't from her mom, who could it possibly be from? Roddy sat beside her, his large golden eyes locked on her face as if he knew the gravity of the moment. It was uncanny. Abby felt a strange comfort in his steady presence, as if the dog were silently urging her to read the letter aloud. She took a shaky breath and began to whisper the words, each one unraveling a deeper mystery. "Dearest Abby, if you're reading this, it means I have found the courage to reach out to you. For years, I've held this secret close to my heart, but Christmas is the season of miracles, and maybe it's time for the truth. You deserve to know who you are, where you come from, and how much you are loved by people you've never even met. I hope this letter finds its way to you, even if I can't deliver it myself. Always remember, Abby, that love is the most powerful gift of all, and it's never too late to make things right. Merry Christmas, my little star. Love always, Mom." Abby's heart pounded in her chest. The words seemed to glow with meaning, but they left her with more questions than answers. What did the letter mean by the truth? And who was this Mom, if not Laura? She stared at the letter, her 11-year-old mind trying to piece together a puzzle she hadn't known existed. "Roddy?" she whispered, glancing down at the dog. "Where did you find this?" Roddy wagged his tail slightly and nudged her hand with his wet nose, his eyes filled with urgency. Abby wasn't sure how, but she felt like he was trying to tell her something. Unable to sit still, she crept out of her room, clutching the letter in her hand. Roddy followed silently, his steps soft on the carpeted floor. Abby tiptoed down the hall and peeked into her parents' room. Her mom was asleep, her face peaceful despite the lines of worry that had become more pronounced over the last year. Her dad's soft snores filled the room. Abby hesitated. Should she wake them? Should she show them the letter? Something stopped her. Maybe it was the fear of how they might react, or the feeling that this letter was meant for her, and her alone, at least for now. Instead, she went back to the living room, Roddy padding faithfully at her side. The tree lights cast a soft glow over the room, and the fireplace crackled faintly, the last embers of the evening still alive. Abby sank onto the couch, staring at the letter again. "Who are you, really?" she murmured to herself, the words addressed more to the mysterious Mom than anyone else. Roddy let out a soft whine and nosed at the envelope, drawing Abby's attention back to it. She noticed something she hadn't before. A faint bulge in the envelope's corner. Reaching inside, she pulled out a small, folded photograph. Her breath caught as she unfolded it. The photo was old, the edges yellowed with time. It showed a young woman with Abby's bright green eyes and wavy brown hair, standing in front of a Christmas tree that looked strikingly similar to the one in their living room. The woman was holding a baby with a familiar smile. Abby's smile. Her heart raced. Was this her biological mother? 1,000 thoughts flooded her mind, each one louder than the last. Had her parents lied to her about who she was? Did her mom, Laura, know about this? And how had this letter ended up under their tree tonight, of all nights? Before she could spiral further, Roddy let out a sharp bark. Abby jumped, startled, and turned to see the golden retriever standing at the window, his ears perked and his body tense. His bark wasn't loud, but it was deliberate, almost like he was trying to get her attention. "What is it, boy?" she asked, standing up. Roddy turned to her, then back to the window, pawing at it anxiously. Abby walked over, pulling the curtain aside. Snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the yard in soft white. The world outside looked peaceful, quiet even, but Roddy wouldn't stop barking, his nose pressed against the glass as he stared into the distance. And then, she saw it. At the edge of their yard, barely visible under the glow of the streetlight, was a figure, someone standing completely still in the snow, as if they were waiting for something. Abby's heart skipped a beat. The figure wasn't moving, and she couldn't make out any details. It was too far, and the snow was falling too thickly. But whoever it was, they were staring at their house. Roddy let out another bark, this one sharper, and then turned to Abby. He grabbed the sleeve of her pajama top, gently with his mouth, tugging at it as if to say, "Come on." "Roddy, no," Abby whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm not going out there." But the golden retriever didn't let up. He pulled her sleeve again, his tail wagging slightly, his urgency palpable. Abby swallowed hard. The letter, the photo, the figure outside. It was all too much. And yet, some invisible thread was pulling her forward. Roddy seemed to sense it too. Before she knew what she was doing, she was slipping on her boots and coat over her pajamas. The letter was still clutched tightly in her hand. Roddy wagged his tail and barked softly, as if encouraging her. Together, they opened the front door and stepped into the cold, snowy night. The figure was gone. Abby stared at the spot where they had been, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Where did they go?" she whispered, turning to Roddy. But the dog was already on the move, his nose to the ground, following a scent trail. "Roddy, wait," Abby called, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. She tightened her coat around her and followed him into the snow, the letter in her pocket and a storm of unanswered questions in her heart. The night was eerily silent as Abby trudged through the snow, the cold biting at her exposed cheeks. The world outside her house felt completely different, almost otherworldly, under the pale glow of the moon and the soft blanket of snow that stretched endlessly before her. Roddy, golden against the white expanse, moved with purpose, his nose to the ground as he followed the invisible trail. "Roddy, where are we going?" Abby whispered, her breath visible in the icy air. She clutched the letter in her pocket, its crinkled edges pressed against her fingers like a lifeline. Roddy didn't stop. He seemed possessed by an unshakable determination, his tail wagging slightly, but his posture alert. Abby couldn't help but trust him. Roddy had always been more than just a dog. He was her protector, her best friend, and now it seemed, her guide. They moved through the yard and past the picket fence that bordered her home, stepping onto the snow-covered sidewalk. The figure she had seen earlier was nowhere to be found, but Roddy's behavior made it clear that they were on the trail of something, or someone. Abby's boots crunched against the snow as they crossed the street, heading toward the edge of the neighborhood where the houses became sparse and the woods began. She hesitated at the tree line, the tall pines looking dark and menacing under the moonlight. "Roddy," she called softly, her voice shaking, "are you sure about this?" The golden retriever paused, turning back to look at her. His warm, intelligent eyes met hers, and for a moment Abby felt a surge of reassurance. Roddy gave a short bark, almost as if to say, "Trust me." Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. Abby swallowed hard and followed. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of branches weighed down by snow. Abby stayed close to Roddy, her small frame dwarfed by the towering trees around her. She couldn't help but think about the letter again, the words echoing in her mind. "You deserve to know who you are, where you come from, and how much you are loved." What had the letter meant? And why had it appeared now on Christmas Eve, when she had never suspected anything was amiss in her life? The photograph in the envelope, the young woman who looked so much like her, felt like a piece of a puzzle she didn't even know she was solving. "Roddy, what are we looking for?" Abby murmured, her voice barely audible over the sound of her own footsteps in the snow. Suddenly, Roddy stopped. His ears perked up, and he stood completely still, staring ahead. Abby froze too, her heart pounding. She followed his gaze and saw it, a faint glow in the distance, deep in the woods. "What is that?" she whispered, but Roddy was already moving again, trotting toward the light. Abby hurried after him, her breath coming in short bursts as her curiosity and fear battled for control. As they drew closer, the glow grew brighter, and Abby began to make out the source. It was a small cabin, tucked away in the woods, its windows glowing with the warm light of a fire inside. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and a wreath hung on the door, its red bow vibrant against the rustic wood. Abby hesitated at the edge of the clearing, unsure of what to do. "Roddy," she whispered, "who lives here?" The golden retriever barked softly and trotted toward the cabin, his tail wagging as if he knew exactly where he was going. Abby followed cautiously, her boots crunching in the snow as they approached the door. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was sure whoever was inside would hear it. Roddy reached the door and sat down, looking back at Abby expectantly. She took a deep breath, her small hand trembling as she reached out and knocked. For a moment, there was nothing. Then she heard the faint sound of footsteps inside, followed by the creak of the door opening. Standing in the doorway was a woman. Abby gasped softly, her eyes widening as she took in the woman's features. She was older now, but there was no mistaking her. This was the woman from the photograph. The same green eyes, the same wavy brown hair. The resemblance was so striking that Abby felt like she was looking into a mirror from the future. The woman's face softened and her eyes filled with tears as she looked at Abby. "You're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, you're really here." Abby took a step back, overwhelmed. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice small and shaky. The woman knelt down, bringing herself to Abby's eye level. "My name is Evelyn," she said softly. "I'm your birth mother." The words hit Abby like a freight train. She stared at the woman, unable to process what she was hearing. "That's not possible," she whispered. "My mom is at home. Laura's my mom." Evelyn nodded, tears streaming down her face. "She is," she said gently. "Laura is your mom in every way that matters. But I gave birth to you, Abby, and I've thought about you every single day since." Abby's hands clenched the letter in her pocket. "Why now?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Why did you wait so long?" Evelyn's face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand as a sob escaped her. "I made mistakes," she admitted. "Mistakes that I've spent years trying to fix. I didn't think I deserved to be in your life. But then I realized that you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know that you've always been loved, even from afar." Abby didn't know what to say. Her mind was racing, her emotions swirling like a snowstorm. She looked down at Roddy, who was sitting calmly beside her, his golden eyes filled with understanding. Somehow, it felt like he had known all along. Finally, Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and shiny. It was a locket. She held it out to Abby with trembling hands. "This belonged to my mother," Evelyn said. "I've kept it all these years, hoping I'd get the chance to give it to you." Abby hesitated, then reached out and took the locket. It was warm, as if it had been waiting for her. She opened it and saw a tiny photograph of Evelyn holding a baby, her, as well as an inscription, "Love, always." Tears welled in Abby's eyes as she looked up at Evelyn. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," Evelyn replied, her voice thick with emotion. "I just wanted you to know the truth. And I hope one day you'll forgive me." Roddy barked softly, breaking the tension. Abby looked down at him and smiled through her tears, then turned back to Evelyn. "Maybe we can start with this," she said quietly, holding up the locket. Evelyn nodded, her face breaking into a hopeful smile. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the cabin and the unconditional love of her dog, Abby began to understand the true meaning of family and the power of forgiveness. The silence that followed was heavy, yet filled with unspoken words. Abby clutched the locket in her small hand, its weight both comforting and overwhelming. Evelyn stood there, her breath visible in the cold air, her hands trembling as they hung loosely at her sides. Roddy sat between them, his golden coat glistening in the light from the cabin. His tail wagged gently, a reminder that even in the most confusing moments, love could still bridge gaps. Abby took a deep breath, trying to make sense of it all. The truth Evelyn had shared was too big for her to process fully in one night. But there was something about the woman's eyes, those same green eyes Abby saw in the mirror every day, that made it impossible to ignore the sincerity in her words. "Does Laura know about you?" Abby finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn nodded, her lips pressing into a tight line. "Yes," she said softly. We made an agreement when you were just a baby. I wasn't in a good place back then. Laura and Tom were able to give you the kind of life I couldn't. I promised to stay away because I didn't want to disrupt your happiness." She hesitated, her voice cracking. "But I've kept up with you from afar. Every birthday, every Christmas, I thought about you. I prayed you were safe and loved, and I see now that you are." Abby's heart twisted. She could hear the pain in Evelyn's voice, the regret, the love, the hope. It made her think of Laura, Of all the nights her mom had stayed up late to sew costumes for school plays or bake cookies for class parties. It made her think of Tom, who worked so hard to keep their family afloat, even when things got tough. "I love my mom and dad," Abby said, her voice trembling. Evelyn's face softened, her tears spilling freely now. "And you should," she replied. "They're your parents. They gave you a beautiful life. I don't want to take that away from you, Abby. I could never take that away. I just wanted you to know the truth, to know where you came from." Abby looked down at the locket in her hand. The inscription, "Love, Always," seemed to glow in the firelight spilling from the cabin's windows. She didn't fully understand the complexity of what Evelyn was saying, but one thing was clear. This woman, her birth mother, carried a love for her that had never faded. Before Abby could respond, Roddy stood and barked softly, turning his head toward the woods. His ears perked, and he sniffed the air, as if sensing something. Evelyn frowned slightly and looked around. "What is it, boy?" Abby knelt beside him, placing a hand on his fur. "Roddy, what's wrong?" And then she heard it, the faint crunching of footsteps in the snow. She turned quickly, her breath catching as two familiar figures emerged from the shadows of the trees. "Abby?" Laura's voice rang out, her tone laced with worry and relief. Tom was close behind her, holding a flashlight that cut through the darkness. Both of them looked disheveled, their faces flushed from the cold and fear. "Mom, Dad!" Abby cried, her voice breaking as she ran toward them. She threw herself into Laura's arms, feeling the warmth and safety of her mother's embrace. "We woke up and you were gone," Laura said, holding her tightly. "We were so scared. What were you thinking, running out into the woods in the middle of the night?" Tom crouched down beside them, his strong arms wrapping around both Laura and Abby. "You scared us half to death, kiddo," he said softly, his voice trembling. Abby pulled back slightly, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But I had to come. Roddy brought me here. He found something." Her voice faltered as she glanced back toward the cabin. Evelyn was still standing in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her face pale and anxious. Laura followed Abby's gaze, and when her eyes landed on Evelyn, she froze. The two women stared at each other for a long moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air like a fragile ornament on the edge of shattering. "Evelyn," Laura finally said, her voice heavy with emotion. Evelyn stepped forward tentatively, her eyes darting between Laura and Abby. "Laura," she said softly, I didn't mean for this to happen tonight. I just wanted Abby to have the letter. I didn't think she'd—" Her voice broke and she shook her head. "I'm so sorry." Laura's grip on Abby tightened, her face a mixture of protectiveness and pain. "You had no right to come here," she said, her voice trembling. "We agreed." "Mom," Abby interrupted, her voice small but firm. She pulled the letter from her pocket and held it out. "She just wanted me to know the truth." Laura stared at the letter, her expression softening as her eyes filled with tears. She looked at Evelyn, then back at Abby, and finally at Roddy, who sat calmly between them all, his presence grounding the moment. Evelyn took a shaky breath. "I don't want to disrupt your family," she said. I needed Abby to know that I love her, that I've always loved her." Laura's tears spilled over, and she reached out to touch Abby's cheek. "You are our daughter," she said firmly, her voice breaking. "Nothing changes that." Abby nodded, her own tears falling freely. "I know," she whispered. "But can we at least talk? Together? All of us?" The three adults exchanged looks, Laura, Tom, and Evelyn, all unsure, all filled with a jumble of emotions. Finally, Laura nodded. "Okay," she said, her voice barely audible. "We can talk." Evelyn's face lit with a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. As they all stepped into the warmth of the cabin, Roddy lingered for a moment outside, watching the snow fall. He wagged his tail slowly, his mission complete. He had brought them here, guided by instincts no one could explain, and in doing so, he had given his family the chance to heal old wounds and forge new bonds. Inside, as the fire crackled and their voices began to mix with laughter and tears, Roddy finally curled up by the hearth, his golden coat glowing in the light. He closed his eyes, his heart full, knowing he had done what he was meant to do: bring his family closer together. The warmth of the cabin enveloped them, its glow softening the sharp edges of what had been a night filled with so much uncertainty. For hours, they talked, carefully at first, voices tentative, but eventually, with the openness that only love could foster. Abby sat curled up on the couch between Laura and Tom, her little hand clutching both the locket and the letter, as if they were the most precious treasures in the world. Evelyn sat across from them, her posture nervous, but her eyes brimming with hope. Laura spoke honestly about the choice she and Tom had made years ago, about how they had wanted nothing more than to give Abby a life full of love and stability. Evelyn, in turn, shared her regrets and the journey she had been on to become someone worthy of reaching out to her daughter. Tom, usually a man of few words, surprised them all with his calm and thoughtful remarks, reminding everyone that family wasn't just about blood, it was about the bonds forged through love and sacrifice. And through it all, Roddy stayed close. He rested his head on Abby's lap, his tail thumping softly whenever the conversation grew heavy, and straight as if to remind them all to stay grounded. Abby ran her fingers through his fur absent-mindedly, his presence steadying her young heart as she tried to make sense of it all. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the windows, something remarkable had happened. The walls that once divided them had started to come down. There were still tears, still difficult truths to process, but the room no longer felt heavy with tension. It felt full of something else, something lighter, warmer, hope. Before they left the cabin, Evelyn knelt down in front of Abby and took her hands gently. "I don't expect you to understand everything right away," she said softly, her voice tinged with both sorrow and gratitude. "But I want you to know that I will always be here for you, no matter what. If you ever want to talk or ask questions or even just visit me, I'll be waiting." Abby nodded, her green eyes shimmering with tears. "I think I'd like that," she whispered. "But you have to promise something." "Anything," Evelyn said, her voice cracking. "You have to come meet Roddy again," Abby said with a small smile, looking down at her golden retriever. "I think he really likes you." Evelyn let out a soft laugh, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I promise," she said, scratching behind Roddy's ears. The dog wagged his tail enthusiastically as if sealing the deal. As they walked back through the woods toward home, the world seemed quieter, softer. The snow glittered in the morning light, and the air was filled with the gentle crunch of their footsteps. Abby held Laura's hand tightly, the locket dangling around her neck, its weight now a reminder of not just where she came from, but of the love that surrounded her from all sides. Roddy trotted ahead, his tail wagging, his heart full. He had done what dogs so often do without words. He had bridged the gap, brought his family together, and reminded them all of the simple, undeniable truth. Love is what makes a family. And for Abby, Roddy, and everyone who had gathered that night, Christmas had become something far more than gifts and traditions. It had become a season of healing, of forgiveness, and of beginnings. As they stepped through the front door of their house, the golden retriever paused, looking back at the snow-covered woods, as if he could still sense the magic that had brought them all together. Then, with one final wag of his tail, he bounded inside to join his family, ready for the Christmas morning that awaited them. Because for Roddy, the greatest gift of all was knowing that his family, his entire family, was finally whole.